Our topic today is Manoomin restoration in the St. Louis River Estuary with Matt Steiger, Senior Water Resources Specialist, Wisconsin DNR. This presentation will describe the challenges and success of the extensive restoration and partnership to restore the St. Louis River Estuary, wild rice beds, and wildlife habitat for after 150 years of commercial use from logging and mining. This legacy of historical commercial uses of the estuary disrupted and altered these natural habitats as shorelines and nearshore areas were dredged and developed, and chemical contamination impacted the waters. The St. Louis River Estuary is a unique 12,000-acre wetland complex between Duluth, Minnesota, and Superior, Wisconsin. Here, water from the St. Louis River mixes with the water from Lake Superior, producing conditions that result in an incredible amount of biological productivity. Numerous species of fish, birds, and other wildlife depend on the estuary for their survival. The estuary also includes the Duluth Superior Harbor, Mid-America's gateway to global trade and the nation's busiest freshwater harbor. More than 250,000 residents and 3.5 million tourists live, work, and visit the area every year. Over a dozen local and federal entities are involved in the recovery of the St. Louis River. Partners in restoration include the City of Duluth, Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, 1854 Treaty Authority, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and many more. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction. Well, thanks for having me. Like my introduction said, I am based out of Superior, Wisconsin. I've been with Wisconsin DNR since 2011 and in this role since 2013. It's been a learning experience for many years and a really interesting story to tell of partnerships leading to some restoration successes and continued stewardship. So many of the partners were listed, but we have had funding and assistance from many different organizations and people throughout the years of this process, and even before this larger scale effort had begun in the St. Louis River Estuary. So this is just a showing of some of those very important key partners, and I will kind of detail throughout the presentation where we're working directly with other organizations on certain aspects of the work. So the St. Louis River Estuary is ahead of Lake Superior, and it is also in the 1842 ceded territory, and it borders on the 1854 ceded territory. So we actually have multiple treaties that govern portions of the estuary, and all of them have reserved and retained the rights of hunting, fishing, and gathering, as well as the harvest of Manoomin. And just to show some of the areas that we work in and have focused on, the St. Louis River Area of Concern is a designated state and federal and actually binational program between the Environmental Protection Agency and the Government of Canada in the Great Lakes. The St. Louis River was designated as one of these 43 areas of concern in the United States, as one of the largest by defined land area. It includes quite a bit of the watersheds of the St. Louis River and the Nemadji River, and the lower 39 miles of the St. Louis River proper, as well as about 10 miles out into Lake Superior. And that program defined some of the impairments that were seen in this area, and we listed 9 of those impairments that needed to be addressed before we could be removed from the list of the worst polluted places in the Great Lakes, or delisted. We currently have 4 of our impairments removed, and we're working on the other 5, so we can eventually get to delisting. And one of those impairments is loss of fish and wildlife habitat. And through that work and through various funding sources, we have been implementing wild rice restoration or Manoomin restoration at multiple sites throughout the estuary since about 2015 at this larger scale of restoration. If you're familiar with the area, we kind of call this the upriver portions of the estuary. The estuary really begins at the Fond du Lac Dam, and if you're familiar with the Chambers Grove Park on the Minnesota side, that's kind of where it's more riverine. The river takes some bends and twists. The state line twists through this area, and there are many of these shallow sheltered back bays that are kind of off-channel natural habitats, and those would have been historically full of aquatic vegetation and Manoomin. So many of those areas are the areas we've been focusing in. Not every spot on this map has active Manoomin restoration, but it has had some seeding or restoration components in the past and likely will in the future. I'm going to try to play this video. It's a really nice background. This is a video that Wisconsin DNR put together a few years ago.
The estuaries along Lake Superior are where the productivity of the ecosystem is. And so everything is spawning here, birds are nesting here, it's a migration stopover. The diversity in plants is really amazing. And that's partly because of that warm, protected nature of estuaries. If you're here at the mouth of the St. Louis River, which is the largest freshwater estuary in the Great Lakes, you are taking warm, nutrient-rich water and mixing it with cold, clear water in Lake Superior. We're one of the largest ports in the country. So without the estuary, without the St. Louis River, that wouldn't be here.
And they had a settlement right behind us for many years. And they came to where the food grows on water, which is wild rice. So this is the spot they were meant to come.
The Great Lakes region is the only place in the world that this plant exists anymore. And that's why you'll see Ojibwe people, putting a lot of energy and time and resources into protecting it or restoring it. Manoomin is special. It's something that's given its energy to the Ojibwe people and to all people that have eaten it. You'll hear Ojibwe people even say that if this goes away, so do we. We cease to exist as a unique cultural group because this is that central to our identity.
We want to bring it back to what it used to be before, the industry and other things that have polluted it and the toxins in here that have made it impossible for us to eat the fish or for the wild rice to grow or to swim. The future of, our community really depends on us taking care of this great natural resource we have here, and people will choose to stay here, will choose to move here because of this. And so it's integral, not just for our enjoyment, but for our economic vitality as a community.
That video, that short video that we did a few years ago, was part of a series of a few videos. So if you're interested, there's two more that focus on different projects and the area of concern work. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into the details of the area of concern. I'm going to focus now on kind of that next step, which was really putting in a lot of effort into wild rice restoration. And so one of the reasons that we did that is there are fairly good accounts, historic accounts of the expansiveness of the wetland habitats and specifically the rice on this river. So in 1872, the river is full of islands and fields of Manoomin. We're guessing it was 2,000 to 3,000 acres historically. In 1861 and 1824, there's nicely detailed maps of water depths, wetlands, and shorelines. And on one of these maps, it says wild rice and rushes line the banks of the river. And there are other accounts of the of Henry Schoolcraft in 1855 and reaching the mouth of the St. Louis River or Fond du Lac River. They saw plenty of wild rice. So the estuary likely supported that, and over 7,000 acres of wetland and shoreline, or wetland and shallow water, were lost due to dredging and filling. And we have a pretty accurate measurement of that because of these maps. So as you can see, the first major challenge in these wetlands and shallow areas was the large scale of logging that happened during that time. And with that industry came ways to move those logs, ways to move the lumber, and other industries such as mining. So the port was developed very rapidly on both sides. The shipbuilding industries and populations began to grow. And later on, as these industries and other industries came in, the pollution in the estuary was also a major concern. We did not have a good way of managing wastes from both municipal and industrial processes. So a lot of that waste ended up in the river. And through that area of concern program work primarily and the Superfund work, many of these sites have been remediated with just a few more to go on the Wisconsin side of the estuary down in the lower harbor, some of the slips. So much of that habitat that Manoomin could even exist in was gone, let alone the conditions that Manoomin needs to survive and thrive. And we know that Manoomin's cultural and ecological significance it cannot be really put into words for many cultures. So it's a more than human relative for the Ojibwe. It is culturally, spiritually, and physically important to the well-being. And then also as an ecological entity, the amount of interactions between other species is immense. When rice is present on the landscape, the other species and wetlands and shallow water habitats are much healthier. It is a food source for many species. It provides physical habitat for many species, including down to the smallest critters, and also water quality and nutrient cycling functions. It is highly sensitive to changes in climate, changes in water depth, temperatures, and also pollution and water quality, with a sensitivity to the sulfate in the water column and in the pore water or water that interacts with the bottom sediments of a water body. And we know this through many studies. It's been well documented and tested through multiple rounds of trying to figure out that sulfate level that is tolerable by wild rice. And so it has been upheld that the current standard in Minnesota is protective of wild rice. And we don't have the same numerical standard in Wisconsin, but the available data and studies have shown that that is a protective level. So a little bit about the life cycle of Manoomin. It is an annual aquatic grass. And one of the really important things is that if it isn't able to carry out its full life cycle, it will not produce a seed for the future. So once that seed germinates and begins to grow, that's it for that individual seed. It starts to germinate under the water, down in the sediments, as soon as the ice is coming off of a water body. And that seed will begin to grow in a submerged state in like April and May, early May timeframe every year. Usually in late May, early June is when you'll see thin lime green looking floating leaf portions of Manoomin on top of the water. And that's when this they start to really soak up the energy from the sunlight and put energy down into the roots and shoots so that it can stand up. And the Manoomin will begin to stand. Those floating leaves will actually arc out of the water and stand up in that late June, early July time period. Now each area seems to be unique. There's genetic variations between water bodies, between lakes and rivers, and we also see microclimate differences on the timing of this seasonal cycle between areas that, even within the estuary, areas that are a little bit further away from Lake Superior and some of our sites that are very close, such as Eloise Bay on the shores of Lake Superior. So it's likely a temperature and seasonal differences that we see with many things. So once this rice stands up, it begins to grow, it begins to put up larger stalks. And right in July is a heavy growth period for rice, and then it will begin to flower late July, early August. Right now we're seeing flowers begin, and that leads into pollination and the various stages of forming the seed. And in late August through mid-September is when these areas will ripen. The seed goes from being it's much like if you have grown corn in your garden, you'll have like a silk phase and then a milk phase where the corn kernels are very squishy and full of white milk substance. Rice does a very similar thing. It will have a milk phase, the sheaths will fill up, and then it will ripen and fall off the plant back into the water for next year or years to come. And that's when harvest happens as well. So getting into some of the details of the work on the St. Louis River, like I said, we began in 2014 with a planning restoration plan. And that had a lot of information and modeling done around where we could do restoration. So site selection and parameters for water depth, for substrate, all that kind of stuff. And we were just jumping into this restoration with trying to find places to start working. We have since rewritten that our Manoomin restoration plan. We have expanded that to more partners. We have included over a decade of lessons learned and tactics detailing how we're actually becoming successful at wild rice restoration, the methods we use. We have an emphasis on Manoomin's importance greater than just habitat. We have detailed goals and indicators of progress that are both numeric and beyond just metrics of acreage and pounds and things like that. We're including long-term stewardship and education and community engagement into our work. So if anybody's interested in some really good background info, a very detailed plan on what we're doing, where we're doing it, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, it is on our Wisconsin DNR website. The link is here, and I believe I sent it in the newsletter article that was accompanying this work. So I encourage you to go visit that. It's one of those documents that I think breaks the mold of an agency document. It really includes wonderful information. I use it almost daily in my work when I'm working with Manoomin. So we have a larger goal through this work is to increase the abundance and distribution of self-sustaining wild rice within the St. Louis River Estuary and increase opportunities for culturally important harvest, improve fish and wildlife habitat, and enhance Manoomin's resilience for long-term persistence. And how do we get there? We have our Manoomin restoration and stewardship model. We have really found that all these pieces of the model must be at least considered and if not implemented to be effective. So taking just one or two pieces like seeding or managing other vegetation may not result in success. We have found that you really need to address all these things. Monitoring is incredibly important to know what we're how our work is affecting the success and the health of these wetlands, and also in showing success for over time and that these tactics are working. So I'll kind of go through these in a little more detail what we do. And in one of the first steps is site prep. And we call that site prep. And it's not necessary in all our sites. A few of the sites where we were starting from an area that we believe had Manoomin and does not have it anymore, we did some other aquatic vegetation harvesting. So if you're familiar with like a large lake weed harvester, that's the equipment that Fond du Lac brought in over a few seasons in a few areas to give a little less competition for when we were seeding. Since then, we won't do that. We don't want to come in and destroy the Manoomin plants and other plants after the fact, after seeding. So it's kind of a front end tactic that we've used in just a few spots. Then the seeding is also in the St. Louis River Estuary is done through a few different partners, whether it's seed acquisition or actually physically putting the seed in the water. Fond du Lac Band has been a major contributor to this. Since 2015, we've put 96,500 pounds in the estuary. That is an immense amount, a lot of hard work, and they essentially purchase most of that seed from local harvesters. The St. Louis River Alliance has been a wonderful partner, as well as the Lake Superior National Estuarine Research Reserve, to bring volunteer seeding events to connect with our community and youth to get people involved in our Manoomin restoration. I'll show a little bit more of that later, but if you are interested in being part of this work, if you're local or close enough that you could spend some time, follow the St. Louis River Alliance. They do a great amount of work beyond this, but especially helping to restore and protect wild rice on the river. So they put out a ton of information through their website, their newsletter, then their social media to get people involved. Like I mentioned, the monitoring is very important. So we keep track of how we're doing and what we're doing and where, not only for our grants, but also to show the success that we're seeing. So we started many years ago and we put together kind of a scale of biomass, and that's what these colored polygons are. Everything started as pretty much zeros. Or especially red polygons. And over the years, we're now seeing some areas that have not only increased in this biomass indicator, but harvestable stands of rice on the river. 1854 Treaty Authority does a lot of this on the river monitoring. They do it throughout the 1854 ceded territory as well. We use the standard protocol. It's out on the water doing quadrats with a square that you set on the water, and you're taking stock counts, plant heights, water depth, and other information. We also do aerial imagery, and we have done some drone imagery to kind of expand on the ways of seeing how extensive the Manoomin is, and we hope to see move on to these other areas in the future. We haven't seeded many of the polygons that are in red, other than Kingsbury Bay, for quite a few years. This is just some examples of that monitoring data. So the dots on this this drone image are the monitoring plots, and the color depicts the density. So the darker colors are more dense rice. And, we can use some delineation methods to kind of calculate acreage. We can calculate biomass. And as you can see, here's a picture. This is pretty late in the season. We were actually retrieving a sensor, but the biomass of rice, it was senescing and turning brown, but it was very nice, thick, and likely harvestable stand of rice there. So this is showing some of that monitoring data more so on a plot. So as you can see, we had many years of low biomass. We had high water levels. We were kind of learning our methodology, and we hadn't implemented any major herbivory work up until about 2020. And I'll get into that herbivory problem here in a little bit. But as you can see, after some dedication and persistence for about 6 years of restoration work, we finally started to see an increase in our Manoomin on the river. And we also know that there's a natural cycling. So not every year is a boom year. There seems to be years where Manoomin will rest and then come back at a later time. And we'd like to just be flexible and allow for that variability in our metrics and in our evaluation of our work. So pretty recently we have had successes here. As you can see in the aerial photo, like in 2016, this is that same bay I showed a picture of. A lot of open water, some other vegetation, and in 2025, you can see that that nice amount of rice filling up that bay. Last year, we had our highest seeding year ever, almost 16,000 pounds. We seeded 6 sites, and about 78 acres total were seeded. We have been seeding at a pretty high seed rate. That's one of the adaptations that we've done in our restoration. We began with much lower seeding rates on many more acres, and that did not seem to work. We are achieving our area of concern goals for Manoomin and working on our, those are kind of short-term goals. and we're working on our midterm goals of more sites, more acreage, and more self-sustaining rice. We're making a lot of connections with the community, with partners, strengthening our relationships, both with people and this entity of Manoomin. We also have donated goose meat to the local food pantry and emergency meal providers. I'll get into that a little bit, but we have done roundup and removal of geese to bring that herbivory balance back in check. And then also recently in 2025, we have been collecting seed for a consumption study. So the one of the really important pieces is connecting with the community. We work with many partners on this. We have incorporated ceremony into our work, signage and videos, presentations, tabling. We host the volunteer seating events. Rice camps have happened here recently, which is awesome. You can't have rice camps if you don't have rice. So these are all things that were missing for many years. And one other thing that's going on right now through University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Lake Superior Reserve and Wisconsin DNR is to better understand the health of this restored Manoomin in the estuary. We do know with the legacy of pollution here that we're hearing from especially the tribal community of, is this rice going to be safe to eat in this area? So we have been collecting it from many sites, and there's a video here. I encourage you to watch it on your own time here. I think it's about 7 minutes, and it really goes through some of that importance of looking into that health of restored Manoomin. At those rice camps recently, there's over 500 students from the Twin Ports that attended from 17 local schools. Kids had a great time. Volunteers and 1854 Treaty Authority especially made it work, made it happen, and we hope to see that continuing into the future. One of the best field trips they've ever done. If you're out on the river, if you're at one of the landings, you might see this sign. We're incorporating indigenous artwork into our messaging. This is to let people know where they are, what the water that they're accessing is a Manoomin water, and how to help protect and respect that when you're here. This is some of our Wisconsin DNR staff with a table at the taking care of things gathering up at Fond du Lac a couple years ago. Getting out into the community, being present, listening have really been important parts of this work. And now on to some of the challenges. And one of the greatest challenges we've had here is the herbivory, the excessive herbivory of the Manoomin plant as it's growing. And like I mentioned in the beginning, if the seed does not produce, get through its full growth cycle and produce more seed, that is the end of the line for an annual plant. So early on in our restoration, like I mentioned, we were seeing good germination, we were seeing good growth, and it all looked like somebody had come through with a weed whipper and cut it all down or cropped it off. And this was due to a extremely high number of Canada geese that love to live and thrive in this estuary. We have created an environment here that's very very nice for the Canada goose. We have nice manicured lawns that often reach right up to the water's edge, and the populations had been just really out of balance. We do not plant rice in rectangles. So this image here from the Duluth News Tribune drone is actually in Kingsbury Bay. One of the first years we seeded there, we put up fencing, or we call them exclosures, to keep the especially geese out of some portions of our rice beds. And that is to ensure that we do get a little bit of seed production, even when we're seeing high amounts of herbivory. It is no coincidence that the goose has some stages of their phenology or life cycle that coincide with wild rice. We did counts of geese in these areas. As soon as in that life stage where the Manoomin begins to stand up out of the water is right when geese molt their feathers and become flightless for about a month. And so they find a nice habitat, such as a bay of Manoomin, to do that molt. They need a lot of energy. They know this is a wonderful food source, and they really take advantage of that, where it's coming out of the water and is the perfect height for them to browse. So we know that this is normal and natural. It's just the balance and the amount of herbivory we had here in this place was detrimental to restoring Manoomin. They tend to like the more sparse or edges of a Manoomin bed. And when we were trying to start from scratch and restore an area, it was really difficult to have enough dense rice to kind of keep them at bay, keep them on the edges, and still allow for some of that natural food source for wildlife. So prior to the lethal removal of geese, which I mentioned as our goose roundup work, we tried many different things. So we tried fencing, flashing tape. We checked to see if it was in other areas they've had major problems with common carp coming in and destroying plants, but that was not the case. This is actually a fence or an underwater barrier through one of our sites, and you can see there's no difference on either side. So we know it wasn't the carp. We tried active harassment and pushing geese out of these sites a few times a day with kayakers. We were told that swan decoys might deter them. The city of Superior has hosted special hunts in the early season, which is beginning in September. But by then, the damage had been done. Normally, it's in June and July that we see the most herbivory issues with our rice restoration. And there was also some egg oiling done, but it turned out to be a very time-consuming and low success of actually finding nests in the habitats here. So that's when we moved into enhancing or I should say increasing our exclosures. Now these are pretty small. They're 20 by 100 feet. We have to go through a permitting process. We're somewhat restricted on timing of this in both Minnesota and Wisconsin, and you can only do so much. So it's a lot of work. It's intensive, but it is almost 100% effective if they're maintained well. You will see these in most of the sites on the estuary. We are starting to see dense enough and large enough habitats with reduced goose numbers that we might be able to move out of some of these areas, our core restoration sites, and move on to new areas. So we work with USDA Wildlife Services and we've removed geese from both Minnesota and Wisconsin. At our core restoration sites, we have seen a very significant drop in our herbivory, and I estimate it's about 370 pounds of meat that we've donated to the Salvation Army and Damiano Center locally over the past year. So since 2021, we've been doing that. 2026 was our final year of this work. We're done with the grant, and we're gonna actually move into a phase of a goose habitat study for a few years, and so we won't be doing any lethal removal for a couple seasons. We'll see if the Manoomin can now sustain the goose population here in the estuary, or if this will be something we have to come back to in the future. But as you can see, in some of our Manoomin plots, over 75% of the restored rice was getting completely destroyed. This is another some of our monitoring data that shows high and low impact herbivory. So the high impact is where they've completely removed a stalk, and the low impact is where they're kind of munching on the leaves, which we think can be sustained longer into the future. We understand it's a wonderful food source for wildlife, and we would like it to be just in better balance. So we've reduced it from over 90% of our plots had some form of herbivory, down to under 50% is showing that, and a much smaller amount of the high impact herbivory. And kind of to conclude some of the work here, or some of the presentation part of this, I'd like to show some pictures of our of the river and of the work we're doing. So, you know, as I said, we put in these exclosures. This is Alloys Bay, where we're partnering with our Minnesota colleagues to install and remove fencing. The other picture here is a channel margin just upstream of Boy Scout Landing. We have not put seed here. This is all naturally occurring, you know, seed movement. This is where rice wants to be. I think the reduction in overall herbivory pressure has really allowed the estuary to bounce back, and not only for rice, but a lot of different aquatic plant species. The diversity and health of the river seems to be increasing with that better balance of that herbivory pressure to the aquatic plants. And if you look really close, I don't know if folks can see this or not, but there's a little bit of browse on the edge of the close plants in that photo, but I think that's okay because they still have seed heads, and there's still many more plants that are going to make it and produce seed. This is some photos from last year, Rask Bay and Alloys Bay. We were collecting some of the Manoomin for that consumption study. This is this season. We were out on the river fairly recently in July. We've got a photo of Alloys Bay as well as Kingsbury Bay, and some of the what's looking like a pretty good year of growth, and that's right before it started flowering. The community connection and the work we do at the St. Louis River Alliance especially has been really rewarding. You know, bringing people together, putting people in the canoes, throwing rice into the water. The picture of the rice going in the water, that spot this year, that was the first year we seeded it last year, and this year it looks wonderful. There's rice coming up and thriving in those areas that it would have historically been. We like to we bring people together to do all this work. So we work closely with many partners. We kind of put out the call for help installing and removing this fencing, seeding, monitoring. All that work is couldn't happen without partnerships and bringing people together. Just a couple minutes here for questions.
The first question is, I used to run along the St. Louis River back in the 90s and watch the beaver work the trees. You can only see stumps nowadays.
Good comment.
Can you reseed over the capped off areas?
I assume you're talking about remedial sites. To date, we have not seeded Manoomin in areas that have been have a remedial cap of any sort or a long-term remedial obligation. Those areas are all currently in Minnesota. Wisconsin does not have any capped and consolidated remedial sites, so I would have to defer any of that future to Minnesota, but I think there's many areas and acreages in the river that do not have that situation that would be prioritized for restoration. So no, we are not seeding any of the areas that have remedial caps.
How did you determine the quality of water was sufficient for seeding?
We have a lot of water quality data throughout the years. Really, the St. Louis River had water quality had recovered for many decades from major pollution sources. The fish, the health of the fish, the health of other aquatic plants, and actually some holdout populations of wild rice in the estuary kind of were those indicators. We didn't have specific like water quality testing done before seeding. It was more, are the conditions right physically, like water depth and substrate and aquatic plants that we often see coexisting with Manoomin.
What's the Wisconsin DNR's attitude to cultivated wild rice and those who farm it? Is there genetic crossover, and is that detrimental to your project?
I don't believe Wisconsin DNR has an official stance on cultivated wild rice. I do know that we are not interested in any genetic crossover of that in our restoration work. I do know that the Fond du Lac Band has probably some information about how that may affect, long-term Manoomin populations. I do know that it has been altered so that it ripens all at the same time and um, for harvest in different ways, like mechanical cutting of like ponds of cultivated rice. So it's really not it's not anything close to the natural um, the natural way of Manoomin that we're working with. So we don't we don't want any of that to change the conditions in the estuary for sure.
What type of water soil is needed for wild rice? Will it grow in sand, or is it more mucky carbon rich soil that's needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. We see it growing in many different substrates. Um, it tends to vary from site to site, from lake to lake, from river to river. And even within the estuary, we see like Aloys Bay is a place that's very red clay influenced. Um, and then upriver, there's some harder sand, like sandbars and um, things like that, where we'll see rice growing right next to a very flocculent, mucky, silty substrate and it's in there too. So it seems to grow across a wide range of substrates, but I think water depth is more important. Um,
Mm. How is the threat from upstream pollution being mitigated?
yeah, that's a good question. Right now it's trying to uphold the water quality and waste standards that are and laws and regulations that are already on the books. So right now it is protective currently, and we have seen that over a decade of restoration. But the future threats are continuous, it seems, not only for Manoomin, but many of the wetland habitats. Um, so placing a high importance on these wetland habitats and their benefits is also really important.
And do you have any information on levels of methyl mercury in the fish in the estuary?
Um, there is information. I don't know it off the top of my head. We do still have consumption advisories, especially with the mercury in certain species and size ranges of fish. Um, but yeah, that all gets synthesized into that consumption advisory. I do know there is some current data that we're waiting on for mercury and fish. And then also through the Area of Concern program, there will be a continued monitoring, and hopefully we're seeing a decreasing trend with a lot of these sites being cleaned up, the contaminated sediment sites in the estuary. It does take time. I mean, the fish in the estuary do live a long time. We see many of those species spending some of their life cycle out in Lake Superior and then coming into the estuary over the course of the seasons. So those fish tend to grow slowly, live a long time, and accumulate more things. So we will need to, it will take time even after all the known polluted sites in the estuary are remediated, for that population to kind of turn over.
Thank you very much, Matt.
I can quickly answer the water depth question here. We generally see the best rice growth in 1 to 3 feet of water, and it can grow deeper than that, but if it gets much above, I would say about 4 feet of water, it may not have enough energy or stability to produce the actual seed. So the plant will grow, it may stand up, it may stay floating. So we've seen rice in like 5 or 6 feet of water that just stays floating the entire season. It never stands up, it never produces a seed head. So really that optimal water depth is that 1 to 3 feet.